Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Sweet. Alright, so my name is Ameek Singh. I wanted to thank you guys for letting me present today. I'll be talking about Western institutions, particularly liberal democracy, and what we can learn from the Christian Renaissance in Europe and Islam's experience of modernization and faith in their societies. So real quick, I just wanted to tell you guys about my background. I have two majors that I just graduated with. One, international relations. The focus of that track was international political economy, global governance, and foreign policy. The areas that I specialized in were Chinese relations, and also I did a lot of work with Middle Eastern things. And my second additional major is political theory and constitutional democracy. We just call it PTCD because that's way too long a major to explain to anyone. And basically, though that major entails looking at the origins of political thought in Western society, looking at the American Constitution and the debates that led up to our creation of those institutions, and then defenders of liberal democracy and challenges to them, and seeing how those debates are still relevant to the kinds of political discussions going around in the Western world.
Do you mind being a little loud?
Okay.
No, you're
Does that help?
Help,
Yeah.
but
okay, yeah.
We're like way close enough, maybe.
Okay, so some of you may be asking, why do we need these reforms in our Sikh Sangha? And I wanted to bring up two articles from my favorite columnist, David Brooks, not because he's my favorite columnist, but because I think that some of the discussions he had on the American political situation right now has a great deal to do with some of the things that we are dealing with in our community. The first article that I wanted to bring up is called Sam's State of Starbucks. And it talks, this author in particular and others, such as Thomas Friedman and others, talk about how we're living through a time of incredible individuality. So social institutions that are rising in the world, technology, are changing how governments are relating to citizens, how citizens relate to government. And there's kind of a tendency, and it's explained in this article, about thinking that we don't need government, or we don't need larger institutions like religion to organize ourselves, and that everyone can do things just by themselves. And the author concludes in the article that there's little social progress without political progress. And he says that those who assume that you can just be on your own, individual, without any kind of institution helping, he comes to the conclusion that most poverty and suffering, whether in a country, a family, or a person, flow from disorganization. And I think that that's really relevant to Sikhs because of the fragmented thought in some of the ways we have to move forward for our cause. And I think that we need to realize that we have to have some kind of centralizing mechanisms to help us advance our goals. The second argument, or article, excuse me, that I wanted to bring up, it's called How to Fight the Man. And it talks about a 22-year-old kid named Jefferson Bethke. He got a YouTube video up that got 18 million views. And it said that it was talking about why I hate religion but love Jesus. And it says in the video, Jesus preaches healing, surrender to love, he argues, but religion is rigid, phony, and stale. Religion puts you in bondage, but Jesus sets you free. So anyone that knows anything about Christianity knows that that's a false statement. Theologians were quick to jump on a statement saying that it's biblically inaccurate to say that Jesus hated religion. And in fact, if you look, Jesus preached religious doctrine by the fact that he is the Savior for an entire faith. So the guy responded by saying, I wanted to say I really appreciate your article, man. And he took back his statements and took off the YouTube video. And the point of the allegory in the article was to say that very few people have the genius or the time to come up with a comprehensive, rigorous worldview. Being Sikhs, we know that our gurus made the worldview that we have for our religious, interactions. But there are very few people who can come up with political organizations and who can come up with arrangements that best organize people. There are thousands of years of history dealing with people trying different things, trying different ways to organize themselves constructively, and to have debate that's as free and open as possible. And I think that if we try and recreate the wheel on some of these different institutions, then we're going to be, frankly, wasting a lot of time on things that have already been rediscovered a bunch of different times. Throughout the course of my presentation, I'm not going to be saying that we should do exactly what other institutions have done and what other communities have done, but I think that we have a lot to learn from them. And I wanted to, because I have graduated from a program that has taught me about these things, and I think that most people don't major in these kinds of things, I think that the Sikh month would be better off to know that these, the role these institutions have played in history. So, liberal democracy. Liberal does not mean what we know in current policy debates as liberal versus conservative. If anything, it means the opposite of what you think it does. Broadly defined, liberalism is a system of government that maximizes liberty in economic, political, and social interactions. Simply put, it's some form of limited government. And in the Western world, that is the prevailing way that societies organize themselves. So I apologize to the Canadians in the room. I don't know much about your guys' institutions, but I do know a lot about American institutions, and I think learning a little bit about their genesis can help us to understand why these institutions are the way they are. We kind of just think that democracy just went its course and people voted these things in. And I think that we need to realize that they were intelligently designed with certain purposes, and that there's a reasoning for the kinds of institutions that are upheld today. So the Federalist Papers, I wanted to read a quick paragraph in it. They were a collection of essays that the Founding Fathers of the United States published in the New York Times and in different venues to debate the new Constitution in 1877. There's many of them, but Federalists 10 and 51 are the ones that are most pertinent to this discussion on liberal democracy. So I thought I'd read a little bit of Federalist 51 for you guys. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable government to control the governed, and in the next place you must oblige it to control itself. In many civics courses in the United States, we're taught that there are checks and balances in government, that each branch checks each other. But the Founding Fathers had a second set of checks entailed in the society they wanted to make, and that second check is on the civil society level. And the way that they made our democratic system was to allow various points of view to be able to come into the political process. If you look at other Western countries around the world, the level of the variance in political beliefs and religious beliefs doesn't vary as much as the United States. States like California and Texas have very little, commonalities with their different societies. And our Founding Fathers thought that if people of vastly different backgrounds were able to get along with one another, you would have the most stable political arrangements available. So the chief concern that they had, and the reason that they made it a presidential democracy as opposed to a parliamentarian democracy as it is in Canada and in England, is because they were afraid of what they call tyranny of the majority. They were afraid that 51% of a popular electorate could subject the other 49% of the populace to something completely unfair. So what they did was they said that if there were varying factions in society, people who were completely different from one another, it would be much harder to come up with something to subject the 49% of the country to that is against the interests of everyone. So the idea is that if you're going to have big change of any kind, you have to get a broad majority to support you, even to get to 51%. And if you look at the way that the United States Senate is set up, you have to get 60 votes, a much larger majority than 51, to pass any meaningful legislation, besides for passing a budget and those kinds of things. So the founders wanted to have a stable, safe government. It's been reported in the media that gridlock is a bad thing. And when, in certain instances, as we've seen in the last few years with hyper-partisan debates in the American system, that's a fair argument. But over the long term, for sustainable institutions, our founders wanted gridlock. There is a prestigious columnist by the name of George Well. He used to actually teach at my at James Madison College at Michigan State, where I went. And he puts it this way: that American gridlock is not an American problem; it is an American achievement, because you have to get people of varying factions to agree to get anything done. And the thing that I draw from this to talk about with Sikh is that we need to have institutions that allow for diversity of debate, not on the Guruji's message, but on the way to move forward. And we have to be tolerant of different ways to look at institutions that we're going to build. So that's kind of like a 30,000 level view of liberal democracy, where it comes from. But I thought that I'll be talking more about psychological approaches later on in the presentation, and I thought that something at the ground level would be more instructive to what I'm talking about. So, like I said, you have to get a large majority in our system of government to pass anything. And the inherent intent of that is to have compromise of some kind. And there are examples of, I think, two modern ones that really help illustrate that point. The first one was with Ronald Reagan, president during the 80s, and Tip O'Neill, who's the Speaker of the House. For those of you who don't know, the Speaker of the House is the one who sets the fiscal policy. All bills dealing with taxes and spending start there. And the president obviously has the holy pulpit and the ability to veto bills. So most times when you have to pass any major legislation, these two individuals are the ones that have to negotiate with one another. And the second instance that I wanted to show is Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich in the 90s. Both times, the Democrat and the Republican, with their personal views, were very far from one another. The rhetoric in both campaigns, to which both presidential campaigns were very partisan, and the realities of both political times, whether there was divided government. So under Ronald Reagan was a Republican, had a Democratic Congress, and Bill Clinton was a Democrat, and he had a Republican Congress in his tenure for parts of their governing. And so the two things that I think that happen in the American system that come from these liberal democratic institutions are that relationships do matter. I just graduated, I had to get a job, I had to network, you know, you have to, I had to learn firsthand. You have to build relationships with people to figure out what you want to do and how you want to move forward in your life. And we kind of forget after watching debates on TV that political institutions, or any institutions for that matter, are the same way. You have to get to know people, you have to get to the press was there's been books written about how both of them are extraordinarily intelligent. They were able to have debates civilly in private, and they were able to do the same things with Medicare reform and tax reform. So I think that the second thing that I wanted to talk about was perception. When you're negotiating with somebody, I'll talk about this a little bit later in psychological approaches as well, how you approach someone matters. So if you come up to someone in a political debate and you call the president, things that are beyond the norm of what you would do in polite company, if you categorize the debate as something that it's not, and you ignore what the concerns are of citizens, then people won't want to negotiate with you. And I think that we kind of just think that sometimes in making Sikh institutions that because Gurbani is so straightforward that there won't be any problems that arise with people who are trying to make institutions. And I think that we have to go in with an open mind of some kind when you're going in from younger generation to older generation and negotiating with them, because we all have perceptions of what other people are. So I think that that's important to realize too. So I talked about the institutions from a constitutional level, and then also a little bit closer to home at the political level. And I wanted to talk about how that has an effect on American civil society. Most Americans call themselves Christians. The largest non-Muslim country to have religiosity at above 75% is the United States. So if you ask, Gallup's been doing these polls for a long time and they've been relatively steady. This poll was taken in 2010 that I'm showing, and it says that 54% think that faith was very important to them, and 26% say that it's fairly important. So the statistic usually used in political science is that 75% to 80% of Americans are religious in some sense. And that's much higher than Europe and other places in the world where there are less liberal institutions, meaning allowing, having government having less intervention. Yeah?
Do you really think it's less liberal institutions, or if it's just a lack of diversity of religion?
I think that liberalism has a large part to do with it. And again, I don't know much about Canada. It's probably the American model is much closer to the Canadian model than European countries. But I think that liberalism does have has a huge effect on how government interacts with its citizens. So the reason I bring this up is not just to bring up numbers, but if you talk to Christians, if you ask them what their religion is about, they can give you a 30-second speech or a 30-second synopsis of their faith, and everyone says the exact same thing. Because they have Sunday school, they have institutionalized ways that they've used through the freedom that liberalism gives them in a government, from the government, to actively engage in their faith. And they've made institutions with this freedom that allow them to be intelligible when they talk about these things. If you ask 100 Sikhs, even Amritdhari Sikhs, what are 10 tenets of Sikhism? We don't have a centralized Punjabi class institution at the institutional level that would allow them to give the same answer. So what I'm saying is that with the freedom that we have in Western societies to make these institutions, we should make, like I said, a centralization of some of these institutional building so that we can take advantage of the freedom that we do have. And I think that other societies, like Christians, have taken advantage of that right that they have in countries like Canada and the United States and Britain. And I think that we would be well served to do the same with that kind of freedom. So the first case study I wanted to talk about was the Christian Renaissance. One second, let me find my notes. Okay. So broadly defined, it was a time period between the 14th and 17th centuries. To give you kind of a snapshot of what was going on, papal states, which means Catholic political bodies were at war with one another for various reasons. There was disconnect between the average citizen and the church. All masses were given Latin at the time, and the most striking thing I learned in a history course I took on the topic was that priests would have their back at this time, the beginning of the Renaissance, they would have their back to their congregation. They would be speaking in Latin in countries where they didn't speak Latin, and many times the priest didn't even know what he was saying. He just knew, for the sake of argument, say he was saying Moolmanther, but he didn't know what he was talking about. So people would go because they had to, like Saudi Arabia has now. There were religious police that made sure that you went to church, and it was socially unacceptable for not to go in there. And people just didn't have much faith in any institution. There were monarchies that subjected people to what's called illiberal principles, so without individual freedom at any level. And the church was not responding to any of the concerns that citizens had on a spiritual level. So I thought that it'd be worth to bring up 3 Christian reformers. They're not perfect, they have their flaws. But I think that if we had similar reformers in our month for different problems, we would have a much more robust and intelligible conversation about what institutions to make for us in the future. So the first on the left is Martin Luther, probably the most controversial and known figure in the Renaissance. He confronted the church over individualistic thinking, and I think we have to realize that liberalism in its roots happened at the same time that the Christian Renaissance happened, and some of these themes overlap. So the big thing that he had with the church at the time was that they said that the Pope and priests are the only ones that can interpret the Bible. And he thought that people had individual rights, and because they had reason, could interpret the Bible for themselves, and they could read the Bible for themselves. Some mistakes that he made when making some of these obvious kind of claims that we would agree to today was that he called the Pope the Antichrist. So I talked about relationships, if we wanted to do something with the Galtach and have discussions with them, you don't want to start on a level of calling them names and doing that thing, even when a lot of these policy debates and religious debates involve something that's very personal and something to our core. The next person is Erasmussen. He was an author that used satire to talk about the state of Christian clergy and citizens during the time of the Renaissance. His most famous poem, piece of work, was called In the Funeral. And it's a storyline that shows how a dying father is more concerned with his last confession before God instead of actually having lived a pious life. So he's basically at his deathbed, and he writes in his will that he wants his son to promise to go to Rome, become a priest, and say Mass for his father's soul every day for a year. And I guess the lesson from the story is that you should be more concerned about living life in accordance to religious principles as opposed to just declaring it on your deathbed. And it was done at a time, like I said, where some of the institutions around Christians didn't allow for interpretation of the religious text. A lot of them didn't know about these things. They didn't have the freedom to interpret them or to read them. And I think that living on a college campus for 3 years, there's some weight behind the argument that there's a large difference between saying someone is Punjabi and someone is Sikh. People have different connotations of what that means. I know in previous retreats we've talked about what Sikh is defined in the Rath Maryada, and people talk about what's Gursikh and what's not Gursikh. So I think that if you have a more free and open discussion on what Sikhism means to people and what society is actually doing, I don't think that's been happening much in the Sikh community at an institutional level at all. We don't have many people who engage in this kind of satire. It's growing, but I think that something we can learn from the Christian Renaissance is that that is a healthy debate to have. The last author that I wanted to present, his name is Ignatius Loyola. And basically he had, after being sick, having broken his leg, he devoted his life to seva. He went to spread Christ's message to prisons. He helped people engage in charitable work. He set up institutions in Europe to do that. And he talked a lot about how a materialistic society needs to give back. And I think that in a hyper-competitive, hyper-materialistic world that we're living in, we need to be cognizant of these kinds of trends, and we need to be able to talk about these things from a faith basis. In previous retreats, I know that in the Gurji's talked about how so few Sikhs give this month, and how our institutions, whether it's SALDEF or the Christian Coalition, don't have the funding that other faiths have. And I think that's a worthy critique, and I think it's relatable, not just to the Christian Renaissance, but to us as well. All right, I wanted to shift gears a little bit to Islam's experience with liberalization, liberalism, and modernization. There's two frameworks to look at this. There's one right before the Cold War. It's a paradigm called by authors political Islam. And then in the last 30 years, it's shifted to something called Muslim democracy. And I think learning the progression of those two things helps us realize that, like I said at the beginning, we shouldn't be trying to recreate the wheel in certain institutions. There are certain things that liberal institutions allow us to do, and that's why I'm advocating that in Sikhism we have liberal institutions that help, have free speech on some of these kinds of things. So, real quick, political Islam is defined as a form of instrumentalism of Islam by individuals, groups, and organizations. At its core, it's a very utopian and idealist view that Muslim society goes back to the institutions that the Prophet Muhammad made. So it's trying to order society in two ways. One, with the Quran and its constitution, and then all laws have to be in accordance with things that what the Prophet did. The problem with this, and I think this is something we don't really think about, if we were going to make some kind of democratic component to Sikh institutions and say, okay, well, what does Gurbani say? Which is fine, but we have to look at what other societies have had problems with just having no, worldly input on these kinds of institutions. So the best way to look at this would be looking at the example in Iran. The picture on the left is of the Reza Shah. He represents the colonially appointed Shah of Iran. He was a radical secular, which means that he imposed the view that religion is irrelevant to the world of Muslims, similar to movements that happened in Turkey. And what he went around and tried to make, he basically tried to take Islam out of the daily lives of people. So the most famous thing that the news reported on him when he was in power was that he went around and told women to take off their hijab and look like Western, how we look like in the West. And similar things happened in Turkey with the headscarf being constitutionally removed from the lives of people. Let's see. Groups that have worked to do this in a radical fashion, from a top-down approach, usually never work. And that's kind of the lesson that I draw and what scholars have drawn from political Islam, is that using just what he called a white revolution and having that imposed in a society that's religious doesn't work. And that was part of the way that they tried to modernize into the world. And if you go into the Muslim world and pull things like secularism or separation of church and state, they don't think about a liberal mindset that we have in the West. They think about colonialist appointed leaders that try to do this to their society. So I think that if you have, what we could learn from that is that, again, like you don't, political parties like the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami, parties that operate and have been operating from Egypt to Pakistan, tend not to look at worldly experience and have had lots of trouble in governing and learning from these the lessons of liberalism. The other institution from the Muslim world that this morphed into, many of the same parties that I'm talking about in political Islam went over to a Muslim democratic mindset, fall under the category of having a pragmatic, gradualist, and holistic movement that moves beyond ideological and utopian Islamic movements of the past. So it's been widely reported about the Arab Spring, about the different democratic activities that's going on in the Middle East. Some of the concerns that they've had have been on religious terms, but some of the same people protesting in the Middle East are protesting for the same reason people are protesting in Western countries. Many people that graduate in Egypt don't have a job because their market economy hasn't caught up to the rest of the world, similar to how many recent graduates in the United States haven't found a job yet. So what these Muslim Democrats have done, which is what they call themselves, is to take up two things. One is a recognition that you need to consolidate factions. And that's kind of why I brought up the Federalist Papers, because if you form a government or form institutions that allow for different factions to work together, then you don't get into the debate of, okay, well, Sikh says this, we need to just do this. So if you have institutions that are external to that allow for debate and that allow for large majorities to come together, then you don't have the same problem that many things happen in the political Islamic movements of the past. And then the other thing they did was that they learned from different institutions around the world, whether it's liberalizing markets or having electoral democracies, in the same way that liberal democracies had in the West. So they were able to take different recommendations tailored to their countries and to their societies. They didn't take exact, they didn't have a constitution that was written by James Madison or Thomas Jefferson. But they did take the basic principles of liberalism, of liberal democracy, and they applied it to their societies, generally. And many authors that have looked back on this transition have criticized it for not going too far or in the form of liberalism. So they haven't given citizens all the rights that people have in the West, but they've been moving towards that direction. I think that's very important to recognize. The last point I wanted to bring up, and I did forget to bring something up in the Christian part when I was talking, was that many of the reforms made in the Christian Renaissance, it's important to bring this up, were made in a secular sense. So they changed how they educated each other, they changed how their university systems were working, and many of them were had the basic principles of liberal democracy. So they wanted to have secular institutions infused with religious institutions in some fashion. And the way that they did that was to have teaching of logic and reasoning from authors like Socrates and Aristotle. And if you've never read them, they have a large component that are against religion. They think that Socrates puts it that you brainwash kids when they're little with certain stories to have them certain attributes when they grow up, to be better citizens or to be better at the one job that they're given to do. So it was I think that it's showing that they had control on their own way, to say that our ways are not the only ways, and that while faith does play an important role, we can learn from other societies, even those that condemn the way that we live with matters of faith. And the same way, the reason I bring that up is with Islamic institutions. The Gulen movement in Turkey, which is a vast, movement, has many different facets to it. But part of it is funding the creation of secular institutions in Turkey, primarily with education facilities for younger kids. And the thinking is that if you have people who are versed in these kinds of, in liberalism, in just basic debate and logic and reason, then you're able to have a much better debate in society and have citizens contribute much better. And I guess that's my one critique of the Sikh community. Not many people major in the things that I've majored in. I'm not exactly the best example because I'm going into business after I graduate, but I think that learning some of these kinds of skills, being able to think critically about history and political science, would help the community at large.
Question.
Yeah.
My favorite law topics like goals is funding charter schools in the United States. Like, do you know what the purpose of that is?
Yeah, some of his work has been
Can you repeat the question?
he's asking some of the funding for that organization has been in the United States. Some of it's in Texas, correct?
Yeah, he's funding a lot of charter schools.
Yeah.
Charter schools
He
across.
sees that part of his organization's, mission statement is to have more talk on peace and tolerance. And he's saying, to not just in a religious sense, but in, that's kind of scary. Having institutions that talk about debate and having basic literacy in some of these kinds of topics helps, society in general. So his, like I said, his organizations, I think they run newspaper companies too, and they have a wide mission. But part of it is to have those kinds of schools in Turkey. Again, a society like Iran that had a radical secular, top-down kind of movement to try and get people to be less religious. And he's saying that those two spheres are separate, and that liberalism provides a framework to set up that kind of arrangement. So the last thing that I have is on international relations theory. I've been talking mostly about my second major, but my first one was in international affairs. And there are two theoretical frameworks that I think that apply to the Sikh community. One is fundamental attribution error. If you look at the picture on the screen, it's Secretary McNamara from previously in United States history. He was Secretary of State under various presidents during the Vietnam War, was involved in many decision-making processes that led up to the war and happened during the war. It is very uncommon, as you can imagine, for any politician to admit that they're wrong. And this is one of the politicians that has gone out of his way to not only write about the failures of his leader, what he sees as failures in his leadership, but of entire presidential administrations as well. And basically, there's 3 steps to fundamental attribution error. And this is kind of common sense, but when you relate it to foreign policy, you can see how it might be able to relate to how we're negotiating with one another on institutions and Sikh. So first you have an ideological image or an antithesis or another. So if there's someone you don't like, when they walk in the room, the first thing is you do is you categorize them as something that you don't like. You have a picture of something that they did to you, or you have what's called a schemata of some ideological preference that you have. The second thing that happens is that you selectively analyze information of the other country in the context of international affairs or whatever situation is going on with you. So that same person walks into a room, you categorize as something as you don't like them, and then you think that the only reason they're being nice to you is because they want something. So you leap to that conclusion. And then the third thing, which is more relevant to international affairs, is that you make a threat assessment of the other and exacerbate what's called a security dilemma, which is basically both sides thinking the worst in each other when they're negotiating. So the reason I bring this up is not only because in the Vietnam War, this was used to assess the intentions of Vietnamese and Chinese, but also because when we're making institutions, it's important to realize that we all come in with biases to the table. And you have to have the recognition that regardless of what institution you build, you have to have the mindset that you can't put people in a box right when you get to the table. So for instance, we learned in previous retreats when talking about the Rath Maryada that the way that the wording for some in the West of how women's rights are outlined in the Rath Maryada with respect to marriage is not the way that we would word it in today's society, right? We wouldn't say that the son of a Sikh has to marry a Sikh girl. And you wouldn't leave it at that. You'd say a Sikh marries a Sikh. And that might, when you go into a discussion with a Galta or with somebody that comes from a different society as you have to look at what perspectives and biases they're coming with and what their real intentions are. The United States is the only major rich country that has not had a major socialist movement. And one of the biggest contributing factors to many of the decisions made during the Vietnam War with respect to getting increasing troops in Vietnam was looking at China's proximity to Vietnam, looking where their troops were, and then assessing that because they're communists, because they're the antithesis of liberal democracy, that they would automatically aggress American troops and interests in the area, which turned out to be completely wrong. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is there can be large misunderstandings when having negotiations with one another, and we can learn from international relations theory that when we're making these institutions with one another, we have to be open to that as well. So that's the last thing that I had.